Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 51. The Imperial Cloak. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we finished the story of Kılıç Arslan. We discussed how the sword lion fell in battle in the deserts of Syria after dragging the Sultanate of Rum back from the edge of total destruction, albeit an edge that he himself had basically pushed it to in the first place. We ended Kılıç Arslan's story at a place very similar to where it began, with the Sultan of Rum dead, and his son, Şahinşah, captured by the great Seljuk Sultan of the West, Muhammad Tapar. And today, we will discuss how the Sultanate will survive the death of the Sultan who, in some sense, was its second founder, albeit in a reduced form, at least for now. And we will set the stage for the arrival of the man who will, eventually, go down in history as the longest-serving and one of the greatest sultans of Rum, Mesud I. So when the news of the death of Kılıç Arslan and the imprisonment of Şahinşah made its way back to Anatolia in 1107, it of course caused a political crisis. Remember that the messy succession rules of the Turkish political system allow any member of the ruling family to seize the throne, and allow the state itself to be divisible among the claimants. We have, of course, seen this over and over again on the podcast, most recently in 1104, when following the death of Gümüştegin, the Danishmend Beylik was divided between Emir Ghazi, who took the heartlands of the Beylik in northern Anatolia, and Sungur, who took Malatya and the southern territories of the Beylik before submitting to Kılıç Arslan. Now, a similar fate will befall the Sultanate. With the 11-year-old Şahinşah in captivity, it appears that the Sultanate was essentially divided among the various sons of Kılıç Arslan. The lack of clear rules of succession basically meant that the Sultanate fractured as the Turkish military elite, the beys, and the Greek and Armenian nobility and bureaucracy coalesced around the various sons of Kılıç Arslan. This meant that the centralized power accumulated to the Sultan by Kılıç Arslan basically collapsed. But in a way, this still actually speaks to the legitimacy that the House of Seljuk had acquired. Even now, with the great Sultan dead, there was a sense that the Sultanate had to be assumed by other Seljuk princes. Even if they were young men or children, the sense was still that rule belonged to them, even if that might actually mean those who controlled them. Now, our sources for this period, the 5 or so years after the death of Kılıç Arslan, are not particularly good. But that said, we do know the broad outlines. The Sultanate of Rum basically fractured into 4 camps following 4 sons of the dead sword lion. One was, of course, Şahinşah, imprisoned by Muhammad Tapar. Despite being imprisoned, he appears to have maintained some level of support within the Sultanate. There was also, of course, Şahinşah's half-brother Mesud, the man who's going to, eventually win, along with Mesud's full brother, a prince named Melik Arap. It appears that Mesud and Melik Arap basically divided much of the new heartland of the Sultanate. They seem to have taken control of Konya, at least for a time. But again, details are scant, and we can't say for sure what the political situation was in the central Anatolian heartland of the Sultanate. But at this time, it was actually the final half-brother, the youngest of them all, who seems to have been in the leading position. A young child named Tuğrul Arslan. And tellingly, it was less that Tuğrul Arslan was in the best position, but rather that his mother was kind of a badass. She was a Turkish princess, who most sources simply call Khatun, meaning of course princess, but who is occasionally called Aisha Khatun in other sources, which is what I'm going to go with. Aisha Khatun was clearly a very shrewd and formidable woman, and following the death of her husband, Kılıç Arslan, she set about carving out a kingdom for herself, for her son, in Malatya. Michael the Syrian tells us that Aisha Khatun started by arranging the execution of her son's Atabey, a Turkish emir named Bozmuş. If you recall from our non-narrative episode on the military in the Seljuk Empire, Atabeys were Turkish emirs, appointed as regents, educators, and guardians for Seljuk princes. They were thus immensely powerful officials. Aisha Khatun finished off Bozmuş in an alliance with another local Turkish emir, a man named Il Aslan, who she then shortly married. However, this extremely happy nuptial union proved to be short-lived. Trying to get on the good side of Muhammad Tapar, Aisha Khatun appears to have basically double-crossed her new husband and turned him over to the great Seljuk Sultan. Aisha Khatun herself then directed a series of campaigns to the south to expand her reach to the cities of Maraş and the borders of the Crusader states in northern Syria. In 1113, about 6 years after Kılıç Arslan's death, she then married an emir named Beylik, a member of the Artukid dynasty, who had recently ridden into the area of Malatya and taken an important citadel named Bula. Beylik is today remembered as Emir Ghazi, and for reasons we'll discuss in a later episode, he will go down in history as one of the most celebrated Muslim heroes of the Crusades. But for now, from Bula, Emir Ghazi had basically created his own small but rising beylik. Now, with his marriage to Aisha Khatun, he was the protector, the Atabey, of a Seljuk prince, and the Lord of Malatya. And for the next several decades, this beylik in Malatya would chart its own course under Emir Ghazi and Aisha Khatun, with Tuğrul Arslan little more than a figurehead for his mother and his new stepfather. Malatya, the apple in the eye of Kılıç Arslan, was once again effectively out of the control of the Sultanate of Rum. And this was actually part of a broader reality. The fall of the Sword Lion had weakened the Sultanate of Rum, just as to its east, the other beyliks were stabilizing and coming into their own. In the aftermath of the death of Kılıç Arslan, the Sultanate of Rum was overshadowed by the eastern beyliks. In Malatya, there was this new semi-Artukid, semi-Seljuk beylik led by Emir Ghazi and Aisha Khatun. Further to the east, the real Artukid beylik in Mardin, Diyarbakır, and Hasankeyf led by Ilghazi. To the northeast, there were the Mengucikids and the Saltukids. Indeed, the first references to the Saltukids come from this period, though the Beylik no doubt had existed previously. And most importantly of all, the traditional rival to the Sultanate of Rum, the Danishmend Beylik under Emir Ghazi, had stabilized after the death of Gümüştegin. And Emir Ghazi was now the most powerful Turkish potentate in Anatolia. And as we will see, he will eventually use this new status to meddle in the affairs of the weakened Sultanate and become the overlord of all the Turks of Anatolia. Even in the west, we see references to the growing power of the smaller beys who ultimately owed their loyalty to the Sultans of Rum. With the Sultanate divided among Mesud, Melik Arap, Şahinşah in captivity, and Tuğrul Arslan under the thumb of his mother and Emir Ghazi in Malatya, the central authority of the Sultanate had fallen apart. Alexis Komnenos, for example, mentions that Hassan of Cappadocia, that bey who had joined Kılıç Arslan against the Crusaders, led a series of attacks against Byzantine forces in western Anatolia. In 1109, the aging Emperor Alexios had dispatched an army under a general named Umatheus to reinforce Byzantine control over western Anatolia. In particular, their goal was to rebuild the critical city of Edremit near modern-day Ayvalık. The city had reportedly been basically razed to the ground by Çaka Bey during the height of his power, and the region was then further devastated by the Normans during the struggle with Bohemund. The Roman army then marched inland to further reinforce Alaşehir, then called Philadelphia. This was an ancient city in the interior of western Anatolia, and absolutely critical to defending the rich lands of the west from Turkish raiding. But the coming of this Byzantine army appears to have raised alarm bells among the Turks, and Hassan assembled a force to march into western Anatolia. Anna tells us, a certain leading satrap, Hassan by name, who was in possession of Cappadocia and treated the inhabitants like purchased slaves, heard of the calamity that had befallen the Turks of whom we have spoken, so collected his forces, sent for more from other places, and brought up his army to 24,000, and then marched out to meet Umatheus. The Turks fanned out across western Anatolia, bypassing Byzantine defenders to capture as much loot as possible. Hassan then proceeded to besiege the Byzantine army in Alaşehir, before reportedly being defeated and driven back. Though it may well be that his goal was not to sack Alaşehir or destroy the Byzantine armies, but rather to deter them from marching further east. The critical thing for our story in this anecdote is that it was Hassan, and not a Seljuk prince like Mesud, who led this campaign. Presumably, Hassan did have some nominally subservient relationship to the House of Seljuk in Konya, but some historians have posited that he may have been effectively in control of the Sultanate at this time. Maybe, just as Ebul Qasim had seized control of the Sultanate after the death of Suleiman, Hassan had effectively taken over after the death of Kılıç Arslan. Now, that is highly speculative, and we just can't know the details. But on some level, it kind of doesn't matter, because the important thing to note is that it is clear that the authority of the Sultanate itself, the central power in Konya, was dramatically weakened. The smaller beys of the west, the vassals of the House of Seljuk, were now becoming more powerful and prominent than they had been during the days of the Sword Lion. In short, just as the fall of Kılıç Arslan caused the Sultanate of Rum to be overshadowed by the rising beyliks to its east, internally and in the west, the Sultanate's authority over its own vassals was slipping, potentially even dissolving. It may well have seemed to many at the time that yet again the Sultanate of Rum was destined for the dustbin of history. But this downward slide was somewhat arrested in 1110, when, like his father before him, Şahinşah returned from captivity in the east. The exact details of his return are unclear. Ibn al-Qalanisi tells us that, like his father before, he basically pulled off a jailbreak, escaping from the muasker of Muhammad Tapar in 1109 and then riding straight back to Konya. However, the Suryani Christian chronicler Bar Hebreus instead says that he was sent by Muhammad Tapar in 1110, and modern historians like Alexander Byhammer believe that there is likely more truth in this second version based on what was happening in the court of the Western Great Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Tapar. See, back in the heartlands of the western half of the Great Seljuk Empire, that is Iraq, Syria, and western Iran, Muhammad Tapar was attempting to reconsolidate central power after years of war and the simultaneous collapse of imperial authority in the lands of the West. In a sort of grander version of the stunt that Kılıç Arslan pulled off in Anatolia, Muhammad Tapar was basically attempting to cement his power over the emirs in the Western Empire through creating a broad alliance to confront the Crusaders, and sending out a Seljuk prince to Anatolia, a region that was now completely outside of the control of the Western court, may have been an attempt to try to bring some sort of order and a measure of imperial influence to a region critical to any struggle with the Crusaders. Maybe even as a way to eventually reassert the central state's power on the western frontiers if things went well. So sending off Şahinşah to Konya may have well been part of Sultan Muhammad Tapar's grand strategy. Certainly, it does align with his other actions at the time. Thus, the young Seljuk prince, Şahinşah ibn Kılıç Arslan, arrived back in Konya in 1110. He was likely only 15 years old. However, he quickly assumed the Sultanate, perhaps an indication that he had the support of the great Seljuk Sultan, Muhammad Tapar. The exact nature of this seizure of power is unclear, yet it clearly did involve ousting the existing Seljuk leadership in Konya, his half-brothers Mesud and Melik Arap, and potentially other beys ruling in Konya. Ibn al-Qalanisi tells us, "It is said that when he arrived there, he formed a plot against his uncle's son, and having him killed, firmly established himself in his kingdom in his stead." This is interesting, as Ibn al-Qalanisi seems to be implying that a son of Dawood, Kılıç Arslan's brother, held some sort of role in Konya. Now this would not be strange at all, as Dawood had been given Konya to govern when Kılıç Arslan seized control of the Sultanate decades earlier. And Ibn al-Qalanisi was a contemporary of these events. He would have been in his late 30s when they occurred, and surely news and rumors would have come south to him in Damascus from Konya. However, we just can't be sure of the details of Şahinşah's seizure of power. Perhaps Dawood's nameless son, Mesud and Melik Arap, were in control of Konya. Perhaps they were basically figureheads controlled by Hassan of Cappadocia, or perhaps the situation was yet more complex. However, what we can be sure of is that the existing Seljuk leadership in Konya ended with the return of Şahinşah, as the young son of Kılıç Arslan became, in Konya, the third Roman Sultan. Şahinşah then set out to re-establish the authority of the Sultanate of Rum, to enforce the Sultan's writ over the other beys of western Anatolia, with the goal of restoring the Sultanate's authority and ultimately, one day, putting the Danishmends and the other great Turkish beyliks to his east in their place. For his part, with his half-brother now on the throne in Konya, Mesud was sort of out of good options. It seems clear that he simply lacked the ability to contest the throne in Konya, at least for now. And so, Mesud fled Konya and the lands of the Sultanate to the court that had long been the great rivals to the Roman sultans, the Danishmend Beylik, now led by the greatest Danishmend Bey of all time, Emir Ghazi. And being the talented politician and statesman that he was, Emir Ghazi naturally recognized the value of Mesud. Perhaps this son of the late Kılıç Arslan could one day be used by the Danishmends to play politics within the Sultanate. Maybe he could be put forward to challenge his half-brother. Who knew? And additionally, just having a prince of the House of Seljuk was valuable. It increased the prestige and the legitimacy of the beylik, akin to how being an atabey, a protector, guardian, and regent for a Seljuk prince, was immensely prestigious and made you powerful. And so, Emir Ghazi welcomed in Mesud, even marrying his daughter to the young prince. This, of course, further increased the prestige of the Danishmend house. As always, noble families on the up and up want to marry their children into even bluer blood. If all went well, Emir Ghazi no doubt thought, perhaps the next Roman Sultan will be my ally, even under my influence and control, and maybe the one after that will be my grandson. With his great rival for power, Mesud, now a refugee in the Danishmend court, back in Konya, Şahinşah set about rebuilding the Sultanate's power. And he appears to have done this in the classic way of the Turks, a way that would have been understood by steppe warlords from China to Central Asia to the Carpathian Basin. He set about organizing raids against the nearby sedentary imperial society, namely the Byzantine Empire. This is always the key method for binding nomadic warriors to the Khan, or in this case, the Sultan. Deliver victory and its fruits. Provide the tribes and the warriors with pasturage and plunder. And despite the increasingly sedentary nature of the Turkish warriors in Anatolia, this was still a key way to cement the ruler's legitimacy and authority. And it also flowed right into the newly important ideology legitimizing the Sultanate and the other beyliks, the Ghazi ideology, the ideology of jihad. By invading Christian Byzantium, Şahinşah could buttress his legitimacy by being a Ghazi holy warrior, prosecuting the great jihad. Thus, we see a marked increase in Turkish raiding of Western Anatolia after 1110 and the ascension of Şahinşah to the throne. And I think it is very important to remember that this resumption of large-scale Turkish raiding of Western Anatolia actually represented something of a shift in the Sultanate's foreign policy. Kılıç Arslan had of course entered into an alliance with Emperor Alexios against the Norman Crusaders in Antioch and Edessa and the Danishmend Beylik. Indeed, his sending aid to Alexios was part of what led to his defeat and death in Syria. So while the Christian and Muslim sources often present raiding by the Sultanate as part of a primal, unending, and inexorable war between the Turk and the Greek, Muslim and Christian, reality was of course far different. And this resumption of raiding to the west by the Sultan in Konya actually represented the definitive end of what had been a key alliance in the region. So in 1110 or 1111, that is basically immediately after seizing power, Şahinşah led a great raid of western Anatolia aiming at Alaşehir, that same city besieged by Hassan a year or two earlier. Anna Komnenos reports, the Emir Saysan, that is Şahinşah, also called Melek, i.e. Melik Shah, was again trying to get hold of Philadelphia and the maritime districts. In response, Constantinople sent further reinforcements to western Anatolia via Izmir. Şahinşah appears to have been unable to take Alaşehir, which was protected by truly formidable fortifications, but continued to rampage around the interior of western Anatolia throughout 1111. Thus, in the winter of 1111 to 1112, the commander of Philadelphia sallied forth out of the city to confront Şahinşah and the Turkish raiders. Coincidentally, this commander was none other than Constantine Gavras. We, of course, last saw Gavras reconquering the northern coast of Anatolia before being stopped by the Danishmend prince Ismail Bey at Bayburt. Gavras was joined by another general who we last saw during the fall of Iznik, the semi-barbarian Monastras. Semi-barbarian means that he was half Turkish, half Greek. Monastras was in charge of the great and ancient city of Pergamum and the areas around it to the north of Alaşehir. The two generals linked up and were able to drive Şahinşah out of the region. But the raiding expedition appears to have helped the young Sultan cement his power in Konya, and further raids continued to be sent out west into what was now Byzantine western Anatolia. These raids seem to have basically moved along two separate routes. The northern route basically snaked from Kütahya through the valleys of western Anatolia towards Manisa, just to the north of Izmir. The southern route went from Afyon towards Alaşehir, that is Philadelphia, and into the broad Meander Valley, one of the best routes to and from the plateau from the west. This resumption of large-scale Turkish raiding in western Anatolia came at a particularly bad time for the aging Emperor Alexios. Though only in his mid-50s, Alexios had been on the throne for 30 years at this point, and the incredible strain and pressure of the job of Emperor of the Romans had begun to wear him down. And the political situation after 1110 just was not helping. Turkish raiding in the west was increasing at the same time that the empire was facing renewed instability elsewhere. In the Balkans, Norman invasions from Italy forced him to scramble and shift troops from western Anatolia. And in western Anatolia itself, a rebel Byzantine general named Michael of Amastris had set himself up in Afyon, on the plateau itself, creating a huge headache in Constantinople. And far to the east, relations with the Norman Crusaders of Outremer, now led by Tancred, were at rock bottom. Indeed, Ibn al-Qalanisi, reports that the emperor sent an emissary to the great Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Tapar, proposing a grand alliance between the Roman Empire and the great Seljuk Empire to destroy the Latins. This was, of course, music to Muhammad Tapar's ears, as he was positioning himself as the leader of the jihad against the infidel invaders in the Levant. All of this meant that Alexis Komnenos had limited resources with which to stop Turkish raiding. Yet despite the somewhat limited resources of the empire, and having many irons in many fires, the emperor realized that something just had to be done to defend Western Anatolia from the resumption of large-scale Turkish raiding. And thus the aging emperor set to work reinforcing Byzantine control of its newly reconquered and absolutely critical Western Anatolian possessions. Firstly, based on both Anna Komnenos' history and archaeological evidence, it seems that the fortifications near the coast were strengthened and that further troops were deployed to the region. The main focus of these efforts were Izmir and its environs and the key city of Alashehir, which controlled critical routes from the plateau to the Gulf of Izmir. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Alexios crushed the rebellion of Michael of Amastris in Afyon. He simply could not have a rebel general operating on the empire's frontier with the Turks, especially as Afyon sat at the junction of key Roman roads into the center of Anatolia and to Konya itself. This crucial territory had to be kept under imperial control. The rebel general was captured and brought to Constantinople in chains, though Emperor Alexios forgave him. According to the modern historian Alexander Byhammer, Alexios was wary of being too punitive as he did not want the remaining Greek elites in the interior of Western Anatolia to revolt or turn to the Turks. And this fear of the local nobility allying with the Turks is a testament to the nature of the beyliks. How even in this age of jihad and crusade, the beyliks remained joint Turkish-Roman projects, and the Turkish-Roman frontier world was not a world of black and white struggle between the crescent and the cross. These renewed defenses of Western Anatolia would soon prove their worth, and it appears that a minor raid sent by Şahinşah was defeated somewhere near Alashehir. Following this, Şahinşah and Alexios came to a peace treaty. According to Anna Komnenos, her father of course got the better of the Sultan, but the terms of the agreement are not related. That said, though, they kind of don't matter because this peace treaty would not last long. This was probably inevitable. The political need of Şahinşah to reconsolidate the Sultanate's power meant that he needed to raid the empire. So any peace treaty was basically always going to be temporary as long as that remained his foremost political consideration. Thus, in 1113, just a few years after his initial raids to the west, and like a year after his initial treaty with Alexios, Şahinşah again led the Turks on a great raid of the empire. And this great raid was directed not against Philadelphia and Izmir, but rather to the north and the west, towards Bithynia and the Hellespont. That is, towards Iznik, the lost original capital of the Sultanate. This great raid was broken up into two main detachments. In the north, a Turkish commander named by Anna Komnenos as Monolikos led an advance towards Iznik and its environs. Incidentally, Monolikos in Greek means something like the single wolf, leading to the wonderful possibility that Anna was translating a name into Greek from Turkish that included the famous symbol of the Turks, the wolf. In the south and east, a force led by two commanders named as Kontogomes and the Emir Mohammed marched towards the lake of Ulubatı Gölü and Kuşgölü. There they fanned out throughout the region to raid and plunder. The northern group, led by Monolikos, encountered basically no resistance as they marched into what was, once upon a time, the original heartland of the Sultanate of Rum. His troops plundered the area around the Lake of Iznik before moving west towards Bursa and the shores of the Marmara. Anna Komnenos says, "Then they had moved forward in a body and laid waste Lopadium and the surrounding districts, and as the messenger said, have even taken Cyzicus at the first assault from the seaward side, as the governor of the town had not offered the slightest resistance, but fled ignominiously from the place." For the first time in almost 20 years, Turkish troops were on the Sea of Marmara. Afraid of facing the horse archers in the field, the local Byzantine commanders basically kept their troops in the fortresses and cities of the region, watching as the Turks devastated the land and carted off a great baggage train of booty. From there, Monolikos headed west and south, cutting a path of destruction across the Marmara region, even marching to the shores of the Dardanelles. Eventually, this northern army turned around and marched back east. The plan was to link up with the army led by the Emir Mohammed at a place called Eorata. However, we're not sure where this ultimately is. Likely, it is somewhere in the vicinity of Balıkesir. From here, the Turks would begin their slow march home. But this provided Emperor Alexios with an opportunity. As the Turks were marching across northwest Anatolia, the emperor himself had traveled to Iznik to get a handle on the situation. The Turks had ravaged Bithynia and the entirety of the Marmara coast of Anatolia, basically without any meaningful Roman resistance, and had of course collected a colossal amount of booty. This was in some sense totally awesome, but it also meant that they were now trailing a massive and unwieldy baggage train as they started moving home. The emperor realized that this made them a target. Now, he gathered up his army and began marching out of the city, trailing the Turks as they began their slow march back to the center of Anatolia. With the Turks weighed down by their loot and marching with a full baggage train in tow, the emperor was able to outmaneuver them. Passing quickly through narrow and steep mountain passes, he was able to overtake the Turks and made it to a key fortress that Anna Komnena calls Akrokos. However, as with Eorata, we don't really know where that is. Alexander Byhammer is of the opinion that it was likely near modern-day Erigöz, that is, about 40 kilometers west of Kütahya. As Emperor Alexios prepared his army in the fortress of Akrokos and its nearby hills, the unsuspecting Turks entered into the nearby valley and set up camp along the reed beds of a local river. As the Turks prepared to take a breather, the emperor maneuvered his forces into position and launched a surprise attack. Anna Komnena relates about her father that, falling on the Turks like a thunderbolt, he threw all their troops into confusion and commenced a pitched battle with them. Many of the barbarians were killed on that occasion after a very close fight, and many too were taken by the spear. Many of the surprised Turks fled into the reeds of the riverbank, which the emperor ordered set alight. As the flames consumed the river banks, Turks attempting to flee were cut down by Roman arrows. According to Anna Komnena, the baggage train was recovered, and many Turks were killed. Flush with victory, the emperor thereupon began to retreat back to the coast. Following this, however, the Turkish troops under the Emir Muhammad launched a counterattack. Anna Komnena implies that they were in fact traveling at a distance from the other Turkish contingents, and upon hearing of the disaster at the river, swung around to confront the emperor. Interestingly, Anna Komnena reports that Muhammad pursued the emperor after joining up with the Turkomans who dwell in Asia. This revealing line indicates the clear division between the wild nomadic tribes, that is, the Turkomans or the Turkmen, and the troops of the Sultanate, men who likely now resided in cities. Muhammad, it seems, was supplementing his troops with the nomads who lived in the west of Anatolia. This, of course, goes back to the original formation of the beyliks, which, remember, started through the Turks stepping into the role vacated by the Roman military as the Roman state collapsed after Manzikert. These Turks, the urban Turkish soldier caste, were now clearly separating from their cousins who continued to live the nomadic life. And this division between the sedentary and the nomadic Turkish worlds is, of course, only going to continue. Thus strengthened with nomad troops, Muhammad's army engaged the rear guard, and though they inflicted some damage and likely recaptured some of the loot, they were beaten off. The Turkish army thereupon retreated back to central Anatolia, after suffering what Anna Komnena, of course, characterizes as a crushing defeat. Now, Anna is likely exaggerating. The Turkish commanders, at least, don't seem to have been killed, and Muhammad was clearly able to gather together forces to counterattack. Certainly, many of the Turks escaped the destruction, though they most likely lost their plunder in the engagement. But regardless, attacking the Turks after they had already plundered the empire was hardly a ringing victory. And this was, of course, recognized by the emperor. The fact was that the resumption of large-scale Turkish raiding posed a serious threat to the empire. And even if the Byzantines could occasionally be victorious in stopping small raiding parties or in driving the barbarians off after they had ravaged the land, that wasn't going to cut it. And so the Byzantine attempts to refortify western Anatolia intensified. More troops were brought into the region, and defensive fortifications were erected and strengthened along the principal invasion routes used by the Turks. However, we should not imagine a solid border. Instead, this was a loose web of fortifications and strongholds defending a porous border zone. And on the Turkish side, losing a baggage train after an otherwise successful raid was not going to dampen the raiding spirit. The fact was that raiding the empire was critical to the reconsolidation of the Sultan's power. That basic political reality was not changing. And as the state in Konya further consolidated, as Şahinşah's authority continued to grow, and as the Sultanate's power resolidified, the Sultanate of Rum became both more secure and better able to put armies in the field. This led to further pressure to raid as the beys and the tribes demanded the rewards of victory, and as positioning himself as a Ghazi holy warrior became more important and more profitable. And thus, after 1113, Şahinşah continued to send forth annual raids into Byzantine territory, and the Sultanate of Rum and the Roman Empire, which, remember, had been allies mere years earlier during the last years of Kılıç Arslan's reign, continued further and further down the road of conflict and war. This ultimately led the aging Emperor Alexios to decide that something had to be done. Though in his mid-50s, it seems that by now his health was beginning to weaken. Nevertheless, the threat posed by the aggression of this new Roman Sultan was such that the Roman emperor decided that he had to take the field. And so, in 1116, the emperor prepared for what would be his final campaign. 1116 began, predictably, with a Turkish raid, this one sent to northwestern Anatolia, the lands of Bithynia, the environs of Iznik, and the Sea of Marmara, the land that had in fact given birth to the Sultanate decades earlier. As a large Turkish army led by Monolykos marched towards Iznik, Emperor Alexis Komnenos left the imperial city of Constantinople for the last time. Led by the emperor, the imperial armies made it to Iznik before Monolykos got to the region. The emperor led the armies out into the field and adopted a strategy of keeping on the move to reinforce fortifications across the region. As Turkish scouting parties began arriving, the imperial armies fanned out and garrisoned the fortresses and passes of the area. The garrisons were reinforced, but the emperor also put into the field mobile units to travel between the fortresses and attack the Turks in the field. These mobile units, naturally, contained Turkopoles and Kıpçak mercenaries. As the Turkish forces arrived, they spread out and began raiding in the classic Turkish pattern. Particularly heavy fighting seems to have occurred around the great mountain of Uludağ, called Mount Olympus by the Byzantines, and into Soğut, the valley where, in just about 140 years, a certain minor Turkish leader named Osman will be born. And this minor border lord Osman's name will eventually be translated into Latin as Ottomanos. Most engagements appear to have been inconclusive, though Anna Komnena reports that the Turks were defeated in a small battle at a place she calls Kelia. The reinforced Byzantine fortifications proved to be somewhat effective at restraining Turkish raiding. However, at the same time, the Turks were still able to pillage and plunder the region. As the Turks began to withdraw back home, Alexios withdrew some of his forces back to Izmit, determined to husband his armies for a further advance. So after a summer of raiding, the Turks began trudging back to central Anatolia in September 1116, laden with plunder. Thus, sometime in either late September or early October 1116, with his men and their beasts now well rested, Alexios led his army out of Izmit. But this time, his goal was not to merely defeat the raiding party before turning back west. Instead, his goal was something far grander: to inflict a truly crushing blow on the Turks and, God willing, retake Konya itself. If the capital of the Sultanate could be retaken, or at least sacked, perhaps the power of the Sultanate of Rum could be broken. And so, instead of attacking the slow-moving armies led by Monolykos, trudging back home laden with plunder, the emperor moved quickly and bypassed them, and began marching towards the capital of the Sultanate. Once on the plateau, the Byzantines quickly advanced to the region around Ebergölü and Akşehir, then called Philomelion by the Romans. The city, where almost a decade earlier Emperor Alexios had turned back. Now it lay on the Turkish side of the messy frontier zone between the Sultanate and the Empire. As the imperial army approached the region around Akşehir, a vanguard was sent out to attack Turkish fortresses at Kedria, Polivatos, and Amorium, the city that, centuries earlier, the Abbasid Turkish slave army had razed to the ground before the anarchy at Samarra. And I would note here that the forces of the Sultanate were manning and occupying fortresses. In other words, they were not merely nomads operating on the grasslands. This is yet another sign of the growing split between the Turkmen nomads in Anatolia and the more sedentary Turkish soldier caste. But as they began moving on towards Konya, the advance of the imperial army slowed. Because in Konya, Şahinşah had of course received reports of the Byzantine advance, and the Sultan now sprang into action. As his father, Kılıç Arslan, had done when the Crusaders advanced along this same route, Şahinşah now ordered that the land in front of the Byzantine advance be despoiled. Anna Komnena records that the Sultan had set fire to all the crops and plains in Asia, so that there was no sustenance at all for man or beast. This was the fourth time in 2 decades that this exact same patch of land was basically put to the sword to stop an advancing army. And the Sultan then summoned the forces of the Sultanate, and potentially even allies from the east, to oppose the advance of the emperor. As the imperial armies marched towards Konya, the Turks began striking back. Şahinşah had by now assembled the armies of the Sultanate, and was determined to stop the enemy from reaching his capital. He thus sent out large Turkish armies to attack the approaching Byzantines and reinforce the fortifications standing between Alexis Komnenos and Konya. Thus, as the Roman armies advanced closer to Konya, they faced more and more Turkish resistance. Alexios and his men were forced to fight numerous skirmishes as the army trudged forward through the despoiled landscape. On the march, Alexios deployed a new battle formation, one that would be used by imperial armies and crusaders alike against the Turks far into the future. The so-called parataxis, essentially a defensive square around the baggage. Though slower moving, this formation was designed to stop the horse archers from seizing the supplies of the army or picking off a column in an ambush. But despite this new formation, the Roman army still had trouble advancing. The Turks, of course, subjected the Roman army to the classic hit-and-run attacks of the mounted horse archers. But they also attacked the supply lines and baggage trains of the army. Even with the parataxis, there apparently still were supply trains that could be subjected to swift Turkish attacks. This created serious problems for the Roman army, especially because, if you will recall, Şahinşah had of course ordered the land to be despoiled in front of the imperial advance. Though the emperor ordered small contingents to scout ahead, and even to destroy the villages around Konya itself, the main imperial army was soon unable to progress further. And thus, Emperor Alexis Komnenos gathered together his advisors and, with a heavy heart, came to the decision that it was impossible to reach Konya, let alone take it. The capital of the Sultanate of Rum was now definitively beyond the reach of the empire. And so the imperial armies turned back towards Akşehir. Anna Komnena presents this decision as an act of God-following prayer, and clearly tries to dress it up as something other than a failure of the campaign's main objective. As they marched back to the west, Alexios ordered the army to take Akşehir itself. Though Anna does not give us the details, she says that the city fell to an assault of the Roman army. For the second time in his career as emperor, Alexis Komnenos found himself with an imperial army in Akşehir. And for the second time, he would be leading an army out of the city marching west, not east, after the Turks of Anatolia had placed a limit on his power to conquer further. While in Akşehir, the Byzantines reportedly gathered up those Christian civilians and former Turkish captives who wished to leave Turkish Anatolia and brought them with them as they marched out of the city to the west. Imperial dreams of retaking the center of Anatolia were now permanently over. But, in what ultimately turned out to be a mistake, Şahinşah was determined to press his seeming advantage. Having forced the Byzantine army to turn back from his capital, he now wanted to defeat the enemy in the field. So as the Roman army marched back northwest, the Turkish forces began converging on the retreating army. From the northwest itself came Monolikos and the original raiding armies. These armies had been bypassed by the emperor as he attempted a lightning march on Konya. Now hearing of the imperial army's failure to reach Konya and its retreat back to the west, Monolikos assembled his armies somewhere near the river Sakarya, that is, just to the west of Ankara. Monolikos crossed the river and linked up with further Turkish armies from the east. This force then began racing south to confront the emperor. Meanwhile, the Sultan himself, Şahinşah, led a further Turkish army out of Konya. The Sultan had decided to try to trap the Byzantine army between these two forces, Monolikos from the north and his own army from the east. The campaign began in the typical fashion of the Turks, the armies attacking the retreating Byzantine forces with lightning hit-and-run attacks, picking off stragglers and harrying the enemy, attempting to break the Byzantine soldiers' morale as much as anything else. Interestingly, Anna Komnenos reports that the Turks lighted a great many bonfires and howled all through the night like wolves, and occasionally made jeering remarks at the Romans, for there were some semi-barbarians who spoke Greek. Yet another reminder of the messy nature of the Turkish-Roman world, of course. The forces of Monolikos and the Sultan managed to converge on the imperial army, likely somewhere between Afyon and a town called Augustopolis, whose exact location is unfortunately unknown today. According to Anna Komnenos, it was now that Sultan Şahinşah made a great mistake. Because the young Sultan petulantly ignored the advice of the more seasoned and older general Monolikos. Monolikos recommended that the Turks stay at a distance and not directly engage the Romans in a full battle. Anna says that this caused the young Sultan to jeer at Monolikos, accusing him of cowardice, and Monolikos responded, "I, because I am old or cowardly, have put off a close engagement with him up to the present, but if you are so courageous, go yourself and have a try. The proof will lie in the result." Thus, in a grave mistake, Şahinşah ordered a full assault, a great charge to break the Roman armies. The Turks rushed down from the north and the east on the retreating Byzantine army. But aided by the Parataxis defensive formations, the Roman army was able to withstand this brutal assault. The battle apparently descended into hand-to-hand fighting. Pressed in, the Byzantines launched a counterattack and managed to beat the Turks back. Şahinşah's army was forced to fall back in a chaotic rout, and reportedly, Şahinşah himself was almost captured. His royal cupbearer even fell into the emperor's hands. With this charge broken, the Roman army survived and was able to continue the retreat. But though the Byzantines saved themselves from total destruction, they did not themselves defeat the Turks. Manolikos and the now humbled Sultan were able to reconsolidate the Turkish armies and again began shadowing the Roman army. Şahinşah was no doubt chastened, and Ana Komnena implies that he was, unsurprisingly, more willing to listen to Manolikos' counsel. The Turkish army thus regrouped and again managed to surround the Byzantine force. But instead of ordering a great charge and attempting to destroy the Roman army and capture the emperor, Şahinşah instead decided to open negotiations. Ana Komnena, of course, implies that this was out of fear of her father Alexios and his near miss of being captured. But painting these negotiations in those terms, Ana can portray what was fundamentally a failed military campaign in a good light. Yeah, her dad failed to take Konya, but look, he forced the Sultan to make a peace after defeating him in battle. The reality, of course, is more nuanced. Essentially, it seems that Alexios and Şahinşah both saw that there was no real way of totally defeating the other, and even that such a total defeat might not really be desirable. The military campaign they had just fought had basically been mediocre for both sides. The Turks had carried out a successful raid of the northwest, and Şahinşah had stopped Alexios from reaching Konya. But then the Romans had taken Akşehir and bested the Turks in the field during their retreat, almost capturing the Sultan himself. Now, both armies remained in the field, but neither was really capable of destroying the other. Or at least, victory would have been extremely costly for either side to achieve. There was basically no point in continuing this. Both sides had more to lose than they had to gain, and neither the emperor nor the Sultan wanted to march back to their capital defeated. In particular, the Sultan was thinking of the mighty Danishmend Beylik and his enemies to the east. No doubt, they were waiting to see what would come of this great struggle with the emperor. So instead of again fighting a battle, the Sultan and the emperor began negotiations. Ultimately, they agreed to a peace treaty that was, most likely, a resumption of the status quo ante. Şahinşah agreed to refrain from raiding western Anatolia, and, in exchange, Emperor Alexios recognized him as the Sultan and agreed to no further territorial expansion. The frontier between the two states would now be set. And while this doesn't seem like that big of a deal, it actually was pretty important. Remember that before the return of Şahinşah, the Sultanate had been in crisis. The fall of Kılıç Arslan had resulted in the Sultanate being completely overshadowed by its rivals in Anatolia, and itself further falling into political crisis and division among the sons of the dead sword lion. Imperial recognition of Şahinşah was of course greatly valuable. Think about how important recognition of the neighboring empire has always been to steppe rulers, ever since like the first episode of this podcast. This recognition now gave Şahinşah a leg up in his attempts to maintain his control of the Sultanate, and more importantly, it enhanced the Sultanates of Rum's own prestige and authority when dealing with the other beys. And this imperial recognition was also important to Byzantium. Throughout Ana Komnena's history, we see a persistent theme of the emperor basically pretending that he is delegating authority to Turks in Anatolia. It's part of retaining the empire's prestige and authority. So recognition of Şahinşah and the Sultanate was basically a way for the emperor to say, yeah, even though I didn't drive the Turks out of Anatolia, the Sultanate is basically just ruling in Konya because I recognized and authorized them to do so. similar to the way that Alexios had made Ebul Qasim a Sebastos decades earlier. This was a way to both integrate the Turks into the imperial ideology and hierarchy, and to buttress his own legitimacy. With the terms of the agreement thus reached, the two rulers, the Sultan of Rum and the Roman Emperor, met on the fields between Afyon and Augustopolis. Both were accompanied by their retainers, with the Turkish beys led by Monolikos. Anna Komnenos says, "When the satraps espied the emperor from a distance, they got off their horses and offered obeisance usually made for kings. The Sultan several times tried to dismount, but the emperor would not allow it. The other, however, jumped down quickly and kissed the emperor's foot, who gave him his hand and begged him to mount one of his noblemen's horses. When he was mounted and riding close to the emperor's side, the latter suddenly took off the cloak he was wearing and threw it around the Sultan's shoulders." Anna says that this wrapping of the Sultan in the emperor's cloak was then followed by a speech in which the emperor announced that if the Sultan was willing to submit to the Roman Empire and refrain from raiding its lands or assaulting its borders, the Sultanate would be recognized and the Turks would peacefully live in their own lands. In essence, metaphorically wrapping the Sultanate in the cloak of the empire. As I said, this was basically an attempt to both integrate the Turks into the Roman imperial ideology and hierarchy, and also likely an attempt by Anna Komnena to put a nice gloss on what was basically a mediocre campaign. But it had been a somewhat mediocre campaign from the Turkish side too, which was borne out in the results of the peace treaty. The Sultan and the Sultanate had imperial recognition, but that came at a cost, namely, an implication of subservience to Constantinople, being wrapped in the imperial cloak, as it were. Yet all in all, as he prepared to march back to Konya, Şahinşah was likely feeling pretty good. With this treaty of recognition between himself and Alexios, the Sultanate was again recognized by the Roman Empire after years of instability, when who ruled in Konya was very much an afterthought. On some level, the Roman sultans were, yet again, part of the imperial system radiating out from Constantinople. Imperial recognition no doubt improved the standing of the Sultanate and of the Sultan, and Constantinople could be a valuable ally against the rising might of Emir Ghazi and the Danishmands to the east. So in some sense, Şahinşah can fairly be considered to have won a qualified diplomatic victory in his quest to rebuild and restore the authority of the Sultanate of Rum. It was a qualified diplomatic victory born out of an equally qualified campaign. The Sultan had not been defeated per se, but he was also not entirely victorious, and he had won some key concessions from the emperor alongside an implication of subservience coupled with imperial recognition. All in all, though, if I were Şahinşah, I would have thought, not too shabby. This is definitely something I can build from, and my young reign is off to a pretty solid start here. But Şahinşah would not have long to savor the rewards of his peace treaty with the Roman Empire. Because to the east, in the Danishmend court, his half-brother Mesud, and the greatest Turkish potentate in all of Anatolia, Emir Ghazi, the Danishmend Bey, spied their chance. Şahinşah's qualified campaign and peace deal made with Alexios provided an opening. And so, next time, we will say goodbye to Şahinşah and bring to the throne the next Sultan of Rum, the man who will go down in history as both the longest serving and as one of the greatest Roman sultans in the history of the Sultanate of Rum. Mesud I.